What society calls sanity might actually be the craziest thing of all. Michel Foucault, one of history's most influential philosophers, discovered something disturbing about what we consider normal. In 1961, he walked into a mental hospital in Paris and saw something that would change how we think about sanity forever. The patients weren't just the obviously disturbed, they were artists who painted differently, women who didn't want to marry, and men who simply didn't fit into society's boxes. These people weren't crazy, they were just different, but society had labeled them as insane. Think about it, just 70 years ago, if you were a woman who wanted to focus on her career instead of marriage, you could be diagnosed with hysteria and locked up. If you were a kid who couldn't sit still in class, you weren't just energetic, you were labeled as mentally disturbed. Even Alan Turing, the genius who helped crack Nazi codes and basically invented modern computers, was forced into psychiatric treatment just because he was gay. In the eyes of his time, his brilliant mind didn't matter. He didn't fit what society called normal. But Foucault found something even more shocking. When he dug through historical records, he discovered that in medieval Europe, mad people were actually considered special. They were thought to possess hidden wisdom that normal people couldn't see. In some Native American cultures, people who we might today diagnose with certain mental conditions were respected as shamans and healers. The same behaviors that got people locked up in Paris would have made them revered leaders in other times and places. The really mind-bending part? Foucault noticed that what we call mental illness often conveniently lined up with whoever was challenging the power structure. In the Soviet Union, disagreeing with the government could get you diagnosed as mentally ill. In 1850s America, enslaved people who tried to escape were diagnosed with drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that made them want freedom. The same behaviors that make you a revolutionary hero in one context could get you labeled as insane in another. This isn't just history, it's happening right now. People who question our modern obsession with productivity get labeled as lazy or troubled. Kids who learn differently get tagged as disordered. Anyone who questions too deeply whether our normal way of living makes sense risks being seen as unstable. But here's what Foucault would ask you. Who decided what normal is? And more importantly, who benefits from keeping things that way? Remember those people Foucault saw in the Paris hospital? Many of them weren't dangerous or disturbed. They were just inconvenient to the people in power. And if you think we're so much more advanced today, ask yourself, what behaviors are we labeling as crazy right now that future generations might see as perfectly sane? What if the real madness isn't in the people we label as crazy, but in the system that's so quick to put labels on anyone who dares to be different? In his early 20s, Foucault worked at the Sainte-Anne Psychiatric Hospital in Paris. What he saw there haunted him for life. The hospital wasn't just treating people, it was controlling them. A talented artist was drugged because his paintings were too disturbing. A woman who wrote passionate political essays was given shock therapy to calm her mind. These weren't treatments, they were punishments for being different. But what shook Foucault most was how the doctors acted. They didn't seem evil or cruel. They genuinely believed they were helping. Each morning, they'd make their rounds, writing in their notebooks, using big scientific words to describe why someone's different way of thinking was a disorder that needed to be cured. They were so sure they were right, so confident in their power to judge what was normal and what wasn't. This hit Foucault hard because he was gay, in a time when that could get you sent to a mental hospital too. He realized he was just one doctor's decision away from being on the other side of those hospital walls. That's when it clicked. The line between sane and insane wasn't about health at all. It was about power. Look at how we treat crazy ideas throughout history. When Galileo said the Earth moved around the sun, people thought he was insane. When they first said washing hands could prevent death in hospitals, doctors laughed and called it madness. When early environmentalists warned about climate change in the 1970s, they were dismissed as paranoid doomsayers. Time after time, what we call crazy is often just the truth arriving too early. Think about what's happening right now. We call it insane to question working 40+ hours a week in jobs we hate. We think it's crazy to suggest that maybe constant economic growth isn't sustainable on a finite planet. We label as troubled anyone who doesn't fit into our rigid schools or offices. But Foucault would ask, Isn't it actually insane to keep doing things that make us miserable just because that's what society calls normal? The stakes here aren't just philosophical, they're deeply personal. Every time we accept society's definition of normal without questioning it, we risk becoming part of the system that crushes unique minds and different ways of being. Every time we dismiss someone as crazy for thinking differently, we might be silencing the very voice we most need to hear. As Foucault discovered in that Paris hospital, what we call sanity might be the greatest madness of all, a madness that makes us blind to our own chains. This is why Foucault's work matters now more than ever. In a world where mental health labels are handed out like candy, where conformity is rewarded and difference is medicated, we need to ask ourselves, are we using psychiatry to heal people or to control them? Are we helping people who are suffering, or are we just making them easier to manage? The answer isn't simple, but asking the question might be the sanest thing we can do. Every morning, millions of people wake up believing they're seeing reality exactly as it is. But Foucault discovered something unsettling. What we call reality is more like a script we've all agreed to follow. Take something simple, like how we think about success. Work hard, get good grades, land a prestigious job, buy a house. That's the sane path, right? But Foucault found that this normal way of thinking is actually a modern invention. In medieval Europe, pursuing wealth was considered a dangerous mental illness called pleonexia. Buddhist traditions see our Western obsession with individual achievement as a form of delusion. Even today, some indigenous cultures think our way of living, stuck in offices, separated from nature, obsessed with status, is completely insane. But we're so trapped in our version of sanity that we can't even see how arbitrary it is. Let's get specific about how this plays out. In Japan, they have a condition called hikikomori, where people withdraw from society completely. Western psychiatrists call it a disorder. But Foucault would ask, in a society that's becoming increasingly artificial and demanding, who's really crazy? The person who withdraws? Or the rest of us who keep playing along? Or take how we treat children. If a kid can't sit still for 6 hours listening to things they'll never use in real life, we say there's something wrong with the kid. We label them, medicate them, try to force them to conform. But Foucault would point out the real insanity. Expecting millions of unique human beings to learn the exact same things, in the exact same way, at the exact same pace. Look at how we handle grief. If you're not over it in a few months, if you can't jump right back into being productive, there must be something wrong with you. But ancient cultures had mourning periods that lasted years, and they saw this as perfectly normal. Our sane response to loss might actually be the crazy one, denying our natural need to fully process deep emotions. The most mind-bending part? The people enforcing these normal behaviors aren't evil masterminds. There are teachers, doctors, bosses, even our families, all believing they're helping us by keeping us sane and functional. Just like those doctors Foucault met in the Paris hospital, they're trapped in the same system of thinking they're enforcing on others. This isn't just about mental health, it's about control. Every time we label someone as insane, we're really saying, your way of experiencing the world doesn't fit our system, so there must be something wrong with you. It's a perfect trap if you question the system. That questioning becomes proof that you're unstable and need to be fixed. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the most successful people in history were those who dared to be crazy. Steve Jobs was known for his reality distortion field. Nikola Tesla was considered completely mad. Virginia Woolf, Van Gogh, Einstein, all showed behaviors that might get them diagnosed with various conditions today. Their insanity wasn't their weakness, it was their superpower. The really insane part? We've created a world where being normal often means accepting things that are clearly destructive. We call it sane to spend most of our lives doing work we hate. We call it normal to destroy our planet for profit. We say someone's stable when they can maintain a poker face while dealing with completely absurd situations at work. Take social media, for example. We're all acting like it's perfectly normal to spend hours scrolling through carefully curated highlights of other people's lives, feeling worse about ourselves with each swipe. If an alien anthropologist studied us, they'd think we'd lost our minds. But question this behavior too strongly, try to disconnect too completely, and suddenly you're the one with social anxiety or adjustment issues. Foucault discovered something fascinating when he studied how power works. It's not just about forcing people to do things. It's about making certain behaviors seem so natural that questioning them feels crazy. Think about how we treat time. We've all agreed that being sane means showing up at specific places at specific times, 5 days a week, for most of our lives. Miss too many of these arbitrary appointments, and suddenly you're unreliable or troubled. The corporate world is a perfect example of this madness masquerading as sanity. We sit in meetings about meetings, use words like synergy and optimize with straight faces, and pretend it's perfectly normal to sacrifice our health and relationships for a company that would replace us in a week. The truly crazy thing? Someone who points out how absurd this is might be labeled as having adjustment disorder. But here's where Foucault's ideas get really powerful. He shows us that what we call madness often contains important truths. When someone has a breakdown because they can't handle the 9-to-5 grind, maybe they're not the crazy one. When a teenager feels intense despair about climate change, maybe they're seeing reality more clearly than the well-adjusted adults around them. Look at how we treat emotions. Show too much passion about injustice, you're unstable. Feel too deeply about the state of the world, you must have an anxiety disorder. Care too much about others' suffering, you might be too sensitive. We've created a version of sanity that requires us to be partially numb just to function. Some of the most respected philosophers and spiritual leaders in history would probably be diagnosed with various disorders today. Buddha left his family to sit under a tree. Diogenes lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great to stop blocking his sunlight. Jesus talked about giving away all your possessions. By today's standards, these weren't the actions of well-adjusted individuals. The greatest trick of power, Foucault would say, isn't making you do things you don't want to do. It's making you believe that doing those things is the only sane option. But here's the hope. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. And maybe, just maybe, choosing to be a little crazy by society's standards is the sanest choice you can make. Throughout history, some of the greatest insights came from people who looked crazy to their contemporaries. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth, really just asking too many questions about things everyone took for granted. Nietzsche's ideas were dismissed as the ravings of a madman until they revolutionized modern philosophy. Even Einstein, when he first suggested that time itself could bend and stretch, was met with skepticism that bordered on questioning his sanity. But Foucault takes this further than anyone before him. He shows us that the very way we think about thinking is trapped in invisible cages. When Darwin first suggested humans evolved from apes, it wasn't just controversial. Many thought he'd lost his mind. Why? Because he challenged not just a fact, but the entire framework people use to understand their place in the universe. The same thing happens today. Suggest that maybe infinite economic growth on a finite planet isn't possible? You're not being realistic. Question whether we should spend most of our waking hours working? You're not thinking rationally. Point out that our entire way of life is causing mass extinction? You're being hysterical. The system hasn't just defined what we can think. It's defined what counts as thinking. This is why genuine creativity often looks like madness at first. When the iPhone was first announced, many sane business experts thought it would fail. When Wikipedia started, the rational take was that letting anyone edit an encyclopedia was insane. The most transformative ideas often come from people willing to be seen as crazy. Eastern philosophers figured this out centuries ago. Zen masters would often act in ways that seemed completely mad, breaking sacred objects, giving nonsense answers to serious questions. But their madness had a purpose: to break their students out of rigid, conventional ways of thinking. As one Zen saying goes, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Sounds crazy, right? But it's about not letting any idea, even spiritual ones, become a mental prison. Think about the people we now celebrate as visionaries. Martin Luther King Jr. was labeled as an extremist and troublemaker. Early environmentalists were dismissed as crazy hippies. Computer pioneers were seen as weird nerds. Their madness wasn't a flaw. It was their ability to see beyond what everyone else took for granted. Foucault's genius was showing us that what we call reason is often just the madness of the majority. When everyone believes something crazy, Pointing out its insanity becomes a symptom of mental illness. But maybe, just maybe, the ability to see the madness in what everyone else calls normal isn't a weakness to be cured. It's a superpower to be developed. This leaves us with a profound choice. We can stay sane by society's standards, following all the rules and accepting all the usual assumptions. Or we can dare to be a little mad, questioning what others take for granted, seeing possibilities others miss, and maybe, just maybe, helping to create a world that's a little less insane than the one we have now. Look around at what we call normal today. We wake up to artificial alarms, rush to jobs we often hate, spend our lives building someone else's dreams, and call that success. Meanwhile, someone who chooses to live simply, work less, and prioritize happiness is seen as unstable or unsuccessful. Who's really crazy here? Foucault's work wasn't just about pointing out these contradictions. It was a wake-up call. When a doctor labels someone as mentally ill, they're not just making a medical diagnosis, they're exercising power. When society calls someone crazy, it's not just an observation. It's a way to control behavior that threatens the status quo. Think about whistleblowers like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning. The moment they exposed uncomfortable truths, what happened? People started questioning their mental stability. This is exactly what Foucault warned us about. The system protects itself by labeling its critics as unstable. It's a perfect circle. If you see something wrong with the system, that very observation becomes proof that something's wrong with you. But here's the beautiful irony Foucault discovered. Throughout history, it's often the madmen who turn out to be the sanest among us. Van Gogh saw colors no one else could see, and now his paintings sell for millions. Tesla talked about wireless communication a century before Wi-Fi, and people thought he was nuts. The label of crazy might just be the price tag for being ahead of your time. Frank Zappa said it perfectly. Without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. Maybe what we need isn't more sanity, but more of the right kind of madness, the kind that questions everything, that sees possibilities where others see problems, that dares to imagine a world different from the one we've been told is normal. So next time someone calls you crazy for questioning the way things are, remember Foucault. Maybe you're not crazy. Maybe you're just sane enough to see the madness in what everyone else calls normal. And in a world that's racing toward climate catastrophe while arguing about social media likes, a little madness might be exactly what we need. Because in the end, the real insanity isn't in the people who question the system. It's in blindly accepting a system that's destroying our planet, our communities, and our souls, while calling it normal. As Foucault showed us, sometimes the craziest thing you can do is stay sane in an insane world. Frank Lucas had it right. The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. The same goes for sanity. Those most aggressively enforcing normal behavior might be the ones most afraid of questioning their own assumptions. True wisdom, like true sanity, often comes wrapped in a package that society labels as mad.